Well, hello everyone. Today we'll talk about the inverse trigonometric functions, beginning with inverse sine. We consider the graph of the sine function. It has domain negative infinity to positive infinity and range -1 to +1 included. The sine function is not one-to-one, so to get an inverse function, we must restrict the domain of the sine function. We restrict it so that theta, or the angle, is between negative pi/2 to pi/2. Then we have a one-to-one function in the restricted domain. We can interchange the x and y values to get the inverse of the sine function. It's also called arcsine theta as well as sine inverse theta. Its domain is -1 to 1 inclusive, and its range is negative pi/2 to pi/2 inclusive. Now this is the graph of the sine inverse function. Recall we were talking about, we got the sine inverse function by taking a restricted area of the original sine function. Again, the original sine function was not one-to-one, so we restricted in the area negative pi/2 to pi/2, the domain, to make it a one-to-one function in this area. Then we interchange the x and y, or the x and y values, and we end up with our inverse sine function, which looks like this. Now, in terms of the meaning, y is equal to arcsine of x means the angle y whose sine is x in the interval negative pi/2 to pi/2 included. Let's look at a couple of examples. Now, one more note is that for this negative pi/2 to pi/2, you can think of the right half of the unit circle, negative pi/2, the very bottom, pi/2 to the top. And this is the area in which the sine inverse, or arcsine, lives. So arcsine lives in this area, right? Arcsine lives here. Lives here. You can think of it as living in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4, but in quadrant 4 we're talking about negative angles. All right, so y is equal to arcsine of radical 3/2 means the angle y, whose sine is radical 3/2, and that is in the interval, negative pi/2 to pi/2. Right? So what is this angle? This angle y will be equal to pi/3. It's equal to pi/3 because sine of pi/3 is radical 3/2 in this interval, negative pi/2 to pi/2. Okay, let's look at another question. Y is equal to arcsine of 2. This means the angle y, whose sine is, whose S-I-N-E, is 2 in the interval, negative pi/2 to pi/2. That's the interval in which arcsine lives. There is really no angle whose sine is whose sine is 2. I'm sorry, whose sine is 2 in any region at all, in the interval. So there is no solution to this problem. So there is no solution. Solution here. So the answer here is no solution. Okay, let's talk about inverse cosine. The inverse cosine comes from the graph of a cosine function, which has the domain negative infinity to positive infinity in range -1 to 1 inclusive. The cosine function, again, is not one-to-one. So to get an inverse, we restrict the domain of the cosine function. We restrict it so that the theta is between, or the angle is between 0 and pi. We restrict it, we get a one-to-one function. We now interchange the x and y values to get the inverse of, there should be a cosine function, and this is called arccosine of theta or cosine of theta. The arccosine function has a domain -1 to 1 inclusive and the range 0 to pi inclusive. So recall the cosine function, this function right here. It is not 1 to 1. We restrict it between the interval 0 to pi. This now becomes a 1 to 1 restricted function. We flip the domain and range, or interchange the domain and range. We have our arccosine function, or inverse cosine function, or y is equal to arccosine of x, or cosine inverse of x. What's the meaning? It means that y is equal to arccosine of x means the angle y whose cosine is x in the interval 0 to pi inclusive. Let's look at an example. Say the mean of the expression and find y in the following. So this means the angle y whose cosine is radical 3/2 in the interval 0 to pi inclusive. Right, so which angle has a cosine radical 3/2, right? So in this case, the answer is y is equal to pi/6, because cosine of pi/6 equals radical 3/2 in the interval 0 to pi. Again, if we're thinking about where does arccosine live in our unit circle or circle, it lives in this top half of the circle. So arccosine lives here between 0 and pi. Arccosine lives here. So arccosine theta lives here. So in thinking about it, it's always in the interval 0 to pi. Y is equal to arccosine of 1 means the angle y whose cosine is 1 on the interval 0 to pi inclusive. 0 to pi inclusive, right? So in this case, y is equal to 0. Y is equal to 0 because cosine of 0 equals 1 on the interval 0 to pi. So what the inverse tangent function? The original tangent function has asymptotes at pi/2 and every other pi radians before and after pi/2. So the one that is at the origin or through the origin looks like this graph right here. The range is -infinity to +infinity, and its domain is domain was -pi/2 to pi/2. If you flip this or interchange the domain and range, the arctangent function has domain -infinity to +infinity and the range -pi/2 to pi/2 not inclusive. Meaning y is equal to arctan x means the angle y whose tangent is x in the interval -pi/2 to pi/2 not included. Let's look at an example. An example here says y is equal to arctan of x. And this means the angle whose tangent is radical 3 in the interval -pi/2 to pi/2. So y is equal to pi/3 is the answer because the tangent of pi/3 is equal to radical 3 in the interval -pi/2 to pi/2. Again, looking at the unit circle or circle we have the arctan lives on the intervals negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. That is on the right side of the unit circle. Let's look at y is equal to arctan radical 3 over 3. So this means the angle whose tangent is radical 3 over 3, tangent is radical 3 over 3 in the interval negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, not inclusive, right? And the answer to this one is, pi over 6. So y is equal to pi over 6 is the answer here. The answer. Right? And that's because the tan of pi over 6 is equal to radical 3 over 3 in the interval negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. That's the only answer. Okay, let's talk about compositions. Remember when we talk about composition of functions, the f of the f inverse of x was equal to x, and the f inverse of the f of x was also equal to x. With inverse trigonometric functions is not always true. Sine of arcsine of theta is equal to theta, but arcsine of sine of theta does not always equal to theta because of the restrictions. So it is only equal to theta when it is in the restricted area. All right, let's look at an example. What is arcsine of the sine of pi over 4? Where does pi over 4 live? Pi over 4 lives about here. It's pi over 4. Does it live in the restricted area of arcsine? Yes, it does. So pi over 4 will likely be the answer, should be the answer for this as long as it lives in the area. So arcsine of the sine of pi over 4 is going to be the arcsine of radical 2 over 2, and that's going to be equal to pi over 4, right? Because it lives in the restricted area. What about the arcsine of the sine of 3 pi over 4? So the arcsine, sine of 3 pi over 4, because 3 pi over 4 does not live in your restricted domain because 3 pi over 4 is here. It's in quadrant 2. So it's outside of the restricted area. So this will not be arcsine. So it's going to be equal to the arcsine radical 2 over 2, arcsine of radical 2 over 2, and this is going to be equal to pi over 4, right? Because the pi over 4 is the answer that lives in the required area. Okay, so what is arccosine of the cosine of 4 pi? So arccosine of the cosine 4 pi over 3. Again, 4 pi over 3 does not live in the restricted area of cosine because 4 pi over 3 is somewhere down here in the third quadrant. So 4 pi over 3 would be here. 4 pi over 3. So then we will get an answer. We have to use the corresponding answer that's in the restricted area. So arccosine of arccosine of -1/2 is what it's going to be, and so that would be 2 pi over 3. 2 pi over 3 will be your answer. Okay, then we're going to talk about compositions of different triangles. In this case, it's nice to draw a diagram. Let's look at an example real quick. The sine of the arccosine of 2/3. Let's draw a triangle real quick. So if the cosine is 2/3, theta 2/3, then we need to find the other side. It's going to be radical 5. And so you want to find the sine of theta is going to be radical 5 over 3 after you do that, because it's the sine of the angle whose cosine is this. Right? That's what it means. So that is your answer. Thank you.